G'day viewers, we've got James Hughes here. I'm going to be discussing the term techno-progressive, how it has been used in the past and how people are using it today. So James, welcome again. It's great to see you here. Chief at IEET, it's the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, used to be on the board of WTA and Humanity Plus, and has had a long time presence in the transhumanist community. So let me ask you, what does the word techno-progressive stand for? What does it mean?
Well, the term started to get used about 8 years ago, I suppose, when we started the IET, and we were trying to figure out what the ideological space was that we were trying to create around the IET. It was not just transhumanist, because part of the mission of the IET from the beginning was to create an organization that you didn't have to call yourself a transhumanist to be a part of. And it wasn't an organization for all transhumanists either, because part of the recognition from the beginning was that we needed to be a legitimate think tank. We needed some ideological parameters that could exclude people who were too far right-wing in terms of, racial politics or authoritarianism or whatever. And also we were, from the beginning, pretty clearly distinguishing ourselves from the libertarian strain within transhumanism. When we started the IET, the left of center folks who started it were dominant in the board of directors of WTA. Myself and George Dvorsky and Nick Bostrom and people like that. Although Nick's politics are a little bit more abstract and ethereal, but he was certainly on our side in those initial fights. And we didn't have the term originally. I had written the book Citizen Cyborg, and the term I was promoting in that book was democratic transhumanism. And pretty much the agenda of the things that I was outlining around democratic transhumanism as a set of ideas became the content of this new techno-progressive identity that we started to carve out. One of the early people who we brought on board was a kind of internal critic, someone who was vehemently critical of transhumanism, qua-transhumanism, and of the libertarians, but who coined the term techno-progressive, was Dale Carrico, an intellectual out in Berkeley, California. And he quickly, I think, became uncomfortable with the notion that we had so avidly embraced the term, and that a lot of left transhumanists began to use it as a term. The last time I was in charge of the WTA about 6 years ago, I did a survey of WTA members around the world, and at that point about 17%, I think, of them identified themselves as techno-progressive, as their principal political identity, and the other left-wing flavors accounted for about another 30% of the WTA membership. So altogether, that we're almost half of the WTA membership was the left of center folks. So over the years, we've attempted to do more defining of it. I don't think that there's been a heck of a lot of progress, except that we have gathered increasing numbers of people to talk about and parse out the various issues under this umbrella. So we have people talking about, what's a techno-progressive approach to assisted suicide, or what's a techno-progressive approach to global warming and geoengineering, and a lot of issues that we weren't addressing at first. The first set of issues that we were principally concerned with was in the transhumanist vision of human enhancement. What are the issues around equitable access, safety, and legitimate regulation? There were folks in the movement who argued against any kind of government regulation and who were not comfortable with calls for universal healthcare access through the state. They just wanted the government to get out of it and people to buy everything in the marketplace. And you still see a lot of that around the discussions of DIY transhumanism, that people should just be sticking chips in their arms willy-nilly and not worrying, doing it underground against the wishes of the state. And I think that that's foolish as a as a path towards enhancement. And we basically, the folks who started the IET, we all basically agreed that there should be states, and that states were required to do legitimate safety regulation, and that there should be clinical trials of drugs and devices. And once those drugs and devices were approved, we should fight for everybody to have access to human enhancement technologies through those public health agencies. And also that there are risks of the exacerbation of inequality in society, that it's possible to imagine, just as having a tank is an unequal technological empowerment of one neighbor over another. You wouldn't want your neighbor, next door neighbor, to have a tank or a rocket launcher or a nuclear weapon or whatever. So the state has legitimate interests in protecting public safety and ensuring the fabric of a democratic society by saying there are certain kinds of empowerment that we're going to regulate. So, I also talk about it in terms of like the X-Men. If there actually were X-Men, mutants who could, blow stuff up by looking at them, or cause storms or something, you probably would want those folks to have to register and go through some training and maybe potentially be subject to fines and some kind of state oversight if they misuse those powers. So, just thinking seriously about what it means to eventually live in a society where emerging technologies increasingly create those kinds of potentialities means that you either want to see chaos and anarchy, or you believe that there should be states that that address those problems. Now, as things moved along, we also started to talk about global catastrophic risks, and this is again an area where the techno-libertarian imagination is that the best way to solve global catastrophic risks is for geniuses in their basements to come up with the techno fix that's going to take care of runaway robot AIs or climate change or whatever, and then we won't need stupid governments to get involved. And we thought, well, there actually are government agencies that are concerned about things like runaway AI, and maybe they're not as concerned as much as they should be, and maybe we should be talking to them about these things. So there's the idea of what techno-progressivism has begun to expand well beyond the human enhancement domain, and I think that's one of the strengths of the term now, is that it implies a certain set of philosophical starting points in relationship to debates around, for instance, climate change, GMO foods, animal rights, and so forth, that were not originally encompassed by the term transhumanism.
Yes, it's funny that you mentioned X-Men. Most of the narratives in the films around, the X-Men, it's like you focus around some form of like a... Yeah, the people with the special powers are like inhibited by the state, and they run off and do their own thing. And then there are some evil guys who have these powers, but they're really kept in check by the good mutants, the people who have the powers who are on the good side. And so it's not really framed as in like a social responsibility to enforce some form of like regulation on these mutants, but more like a battle among the mutants themselves, rather than and everybody else is like onlookers.
Imagine how terrifying that world would be, where the fate of mere mortals would be determined by whether the good superpowered people or the bad superpowered people win. I think in the first place, governments will not permit that, hopefully will not permit that. And we already, it's true that in general, the transhumanist imagination, like the people who are opposed to transhumanism, they think that these ethical problems start like 5 years in the future. That once we have genetic engineering, then we have a whole new set of ethical questions. Actually, these are old ethical questions and old policy questions. What do you do when certain people have access to a technology that causes a threat to society? That's an old question. And that will be true when that threat is nano engineering or superintelligence or whatever comes down the pike. But we've had this question around, so for instance, we've had laws about access to certain kinds of supercomputing since the origin of code-breaking algorithms and so forth. And we have international protocols about who you can sell supercomputers to. You can't sell them to China.
Hmm.
So, and who can have which kinds of weapons and who can have which kinds of drugs, and attempts to regulate synthetic biology. All of these things are current policy questions, and they lay the groundwork for how we're going to deal with the emerging technologies of the future. So, at any rate, it's an old question that that people with certain kinds of superpowers, whether they're an automatic weapon, a Tommy gun, or the ability to print money, to do counterfeiting, those are all superpowers in a sense, and we have laws about how to regulate access to that.
Okay, it may seem like a silly question, but it may be a cartoon question too, but what would the world be like if there were no forms of regulation? Would we have society?
Well, we would have some kind of society, and I think you can see what kind we would have by looking at Somalia. I mean, Somalia is one of the region between Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mean, those are basically stateless regions of the world, and they have power. People have power in stateless societies, and there are quasi-state agencies. It's just that it's hellish to live under them. You don't have the protection of individual rights. You don't have social progress. You don't have investment in infrastructure that you could have otherwise if you had accountable government. So, if people want to live in Somalia versus Sweden, I don't understand their moral choice, but okay, I think the choice for me and most people is pretty clear. Sweden's a preferable place to live.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, so back to the word techno-progressivism or techno-progressive. What does it mean? Let's break it up into its constituent parts. Techno is in logical and technological, and progressive. Do you want to define those terms, how you mean them, and what
it's more.
Yep.
It's more about an indication of the overlapping tribes that we belong to. The first is the techno-optimists, the futurists, the transhumanist community, people whose minds are focused on what benefits and risks could come from emerging technologies, who take them seriously. And there are lots of people in the world who don't take them seriously. A, aren't thinking of paying attention to these things, or B, think it's all science fiction, just write it off as things that aren't actually going to happen. So we're people who do think that these things are going to happen, and we need to be thinking about their consequences now. The progressive part is that we also are inheritors of a set of values from the Enlightenment that is not just the part of the Enlightenment about the importance of reason and science and technology. That's part of the Enlightenment value system. But we also are inheritors of the other part of the Enlightenment value system, which is the importance of the rights of man, democracy, individual liberty, equality, and solidarity. And libertarians are children of the Enlightenment as well. It's just that they have interpreted a certain set of Enlightenment beliefs, a certain wing of the Enlightenment, about getting rid of government, state interference, and individual liberty to that extreme. The techno-progressives are more the left-wing version of Enlightenment values. So this is, that particular argument is an intra-Enlightenment argument, and we both disagree with the counter-Enlightenment and with the pre-Enlightenment thinkers, the Christian right, and people like that. So it's a complicated political landscape. It's not a linear political framework. It's a three-dimensional political framework. We're in one corner of that, advocating for cultural progress, economic egalitarianism, and technological optimism, more or less. Although I think one of the things is that the techno-libertarians tend to be unreasonably optimistic. I mean, around things like, DIY biology, what risks it might pose if people start experimenting on themselves with genetic engineering or synthetic biology. I think the techno-progressives tend to be a little bit more skeptical of those risks.
So I mean, like, would you consider grinders as some more of a libertarian bent in DIY biohacking?
Well, they don't have to be. I mean, I think
Right.
you can. I think you can legitimately say that individuals have a right to experiment on their own body, and that there should be government oversight of certain kinds of technological innovation. But it tends to attract people who, who do have those libertarian biases. So yes, unfortunately, I think that culture tends to be more libertarian.
Okay, cool. Well, there's going to be a conference that will be discussing the techno-progressive, and that is Transvision 2014, which is on in a few days. Is that correct? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So this is the first, well, branded Transvision conference in some time. So that's going to be good. It's in France, and it's put on by a Technoprog organization in France. Is that correct?
Yes, they call themselves Technoprog, the French Transhumanist Association, and they very consciously have adopted the term Technoprog, techno-progressive, because the folks who started it recognized that within a European context, and specifically within a French context, the reaction to transhumanism was immediately negative because of the concerns that many French intellectuals had about the inegalitarian consequences of human enhancement, the potentially inegalitarian consequences. And so they wanted to put front and center their own commitments to egalitarian concerns. And this conference that they've organized, this Transvision, is on the theme of social justice and transhumanism. So they've allied with a group that's working on rights for the deaf, and they have a number of papers and speakers who will be addressing social justice themes.
Hmm. And just as a note to listeners, we will be revisiting the topic of techno-progressivism after the conference. So we're going to be talking about some of the issues that were brought up at the conference and some of the mileage gained from the conference about this concept. But yeah, so look, we've already, I guess, discussed how it relates to transhumanism, how techno-progressive relates to transhumanism and left transhumanism. So, well, what are really the benefits that could be gained from something like this? What emancipatory uses of technology should be focused on, and who should be focusing on, and what kinds of technologies do you think need more attention, and how can we use a techno-progressive lens to help guide the answer to this question?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I'm not, now that I'm 53 years old, I'm not the manifesto writer I was when I was 23 years old. When I was 23, I was imagining that the manifestos I was writing or associated with were going to become mass movements, and we were going to have, coffee houses and Boy Scout troops and everything marching under the same flag. My ambitions are considerably chastened. And I guess, thinking back on the history of Trotskyist thought, for instance, that there was a group of Trotskyists in the 1950s who had a very particular vision of what the Soviet Union was. It was a deformed, Trotsky thought it was a deformed worker state. And there was a group called the Shachtmanites. There were only ever about 50 Shachtmanites. But the Shachtmanites thought that the Soviet Union was actually another form of capitalism, that it was called state capitalism. The people who were involved in the Shachtman movement, Shachtman organization, they went on to become leaders in the Socialist Party, the trade union movement, the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party, because some of them went over to the right eventually. But the ideological influence of the particular thing that they were doing spread very broadly. So my ambitions, and similarly with the Fabians, the Fabians never started a mass movement, the Fabian socialist organization in the late 19th century in England, but it had H.G. Wells, and it had the folks who started the co-op movement, and had all kinds of very influential intellectuals. My ambitions for what we might be able to do as techno-progressives, similarly to my ambitions for what we were doing and have been doing as transhumanists, is not that we're going to have mass organizations, but that we could consciously attempt to infuse certain issues and certain kinds of understandings and framings into the movements that we're a part of. In terms of the left and our connection to various movements for social justice, reproductive rights. So give an example, reproductive rights. Reproductive rights organizations, feminist organizations, have embraced a broad variety of the right to control your fertility, but they have not been as enthusiastic about assisted reproduction. Now, from the point of view of transhumanists, the right to have children in the way that you choose to do so is just as important as the right not to have children, and having and calling for those technologies to be accessible to everyone. So, for instance, Italy has had laws that said that lesbians and single women and women over the age of 50 can't have access to assisted reproduction. That's obviously, contrary from a transhumanist point of view of individual liberty. And so we think that there are ways in which, certain kinds of issues within social justice movements that they have been conflicted about because of some of the Luddite strains within those movements, or anxieties about sex selection. We think that there's, legitimate concerns to a certain extent in China and India, but in the West, almost all sex selection is for family balancing and should be, in my opinion, a matter of individual choice. So I think there are ways in which we can begin to broaden the parameters of debate about certain kinds of social justice issues in that domain. Within the futurist and transhumanist domain, we have these set of political concerns that we need to address about the unfortunate techno-utopian bias of a lot of the discussions and the ignoring of actual on-the-ground public policy ways of addressing concerns. Now, I'll give you another example, which is technological unemployment and the basic income guarantee. A lot of techno-libertarians think, well, either capitalism will always create jobs, which is the one thing that they think will be unchanged and unscathed by the singularity. The singularity is supposed to be a point in human history where everything's going to change and nothing can be predicted beyond it, except this one thing, that capitalism will always work and create jobs for people. Okay. And B, if they don't believe that, if they think that it's possible that jobs might be eliminated, then they think, well, there's going to be magic nanoboxes and manna will fall from heaven, but the singularity will provide, which is just purely a theological belief. So to say to them, no, look, no matter what the period is between the elimination of jobs and the creation of magic nanoboxes, if it's 5 years, that's 5 years in which people starve to death. And we think that we need to figure out how to make sure that everybody keeps getting fed and that the economy trickles along for that period. So one of the ways to do that is to take the enormous accumulation of wealth that's gone into the hands of the top 0.1% of the global population as a consequence of these technological changes, take some of that away and make sure that everybody has enough to eat. And that requires government redistribution of wealth. And I'm sorry, that's just the way it has to be, because it's not going to happen any other way. So yes, those are the kinds of issues where techno-progressives, bring a bracing of reality to the fantasy land that a lot of techno-libertarians live in.
Very animated points there, and I'm in agreement with you there, James. I'm hoping that we do transition to a state where we we don't, where we can contribute if we want to, but we don't have to. Where we can actually receive basic income in order to survive, not starve, and be around for this big era of magic nano boxes, and who knows what they'll be, right? But yeah, look, man, I want to be there, but I don't want to die in the process. I don't want to starve.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
It sounds like a bright future if we get past certain I guess various stages of risks. X risk, global catastrophic risks, and part of on the ground, I guess, buttressing against these risks is making sure everybody is catered for. It comes down to the question for me: is society, is social progress meant to include the sentiences within the society or the civilization as an important factor, or is it just the progress of civilization which is important, without regard without any regard to the quality of the sentience experience within the civilization, if you know what I mean? Hmm.
I think it's a big question. I think one of the things that you're touching on is that there's going to be a certain limit to the Enlightenment understanding of politics, whether it's the left Enlightenment or the right Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was based on a notion of the separate, autonomous, discrete self being the basis of citizenship. Now we can, and I think most techno-progressives agree that we should expand that to beyond just being human beings, to be all self-aware beings. So apes and dolphins and uplifted cats and robots and whatever else comes along.
Genius cockroaches.
So, yeah. But then we get to a certain point where it becomes extremely problematic. So if we start, like Martine Rothblatt's just written this book, Virtually Human, and if we imagine a future in which we can create virtual copies of ourselves in cyberspace that have the same self-awareness that we have, does that copy of you get a vote in the democratic polity? Does it own any of your stuff? Is it married to your wife? You know, we don't quite have a political and legal structure that that answers those questions yet. And once we start to screw around with our brains, we start to get beyond our current political understanding. So, you know, what does it mean for a group of people to elide their self-consciousness and say we're all going to bond together as the church of the singularity and share one big brain? Do we then say to them, okay, then you only get one vote? Or do we say you can't do that because that's a form of slavery, like, you know, addicting yourself to heroin? Or how do we deal with those, the Borg? So I think the techno-progressive term and the set of techno-progressive ideas that we've been dealing with so far is at the last stage of kind of pre-political singularity, and we need to figure out how can we instantiate the values of liberty and equality within the existing framework of self-determining, or at least the illusion of self-determining individuals. And hopefully, if we do that right, then we set the grounds for the best possible next thing. And we don't even know what the parameters of that next thing are going to be. What are the politics of post and anti-Borg politics? We don't know. You know, what's the politics of pre and post uploading? We don't really know yet. So, but we do know that some of these things are coming down the pike and that we need to start thinking about them. And we need to think about them currently within the Enlightenment value framework.
What would happen if we think about them outside the Enlightenment framework, or, you know, just before, you know, some of these technologies fruit? What if we think about them when they're already down the pike?
Well, I mean, what does it mean to be outside of the Enlightenment framework? I mean, most of our imagination is probably religious about these things. So, you know, if you say, you know, what's the goal of humanity beyond having a free and equal society where people get to choose their own futures, the humanist vision, it's, oh, well, we're trying to build, you know, a beautiful planet for God, or we're trying to convince the simulator of our universe that we're worth continuing as a simulation, or whatever, you know, grand vision. We're supposed to stop the heat death of the universe by unifying all the galaxies and destroying all baryonic matter and making it into one big black hole, or, you know, bring back to life all the people who've ever lived in the entire universe on the skin of a black hole. I don't know what, you know, the post-Enlightenment value structure is, you know, what one I would salute or find at all attractive. I'm sure that there already are people who talk about those things, those kinds of values, aesthetic projects that would take the place of political ones. But for me, I think creating a planet in which everybody who's conscious and sentient, no matter what kind of body they have, has more or less equal political and legal power, and has a right to exist that's guaranteed by governments, and I think that's pretty utopian for right now. That's pretty utopian.
Mm. Well, okay, let's talk about what accounts for progress. What do you predict? What would be good? What accounts for progress for techno-progressive? That is, we're talking about the sciences, forms of technology, ethics, and social. Um, yeah, well, Gibson said the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. What do you think would account for progress in the short and medium term for the techno-progressive movement? If there, would you call it a movement or just a political philosophy at the moment?
An ideological tendency. That's the old
Okay.
Trotskyist term. Before you're even a caucus or a faction, you're just an ideological tendency. You and the five other guys in the bar. So yeah, hopefully this ideological tendency will flower. I'm sorry, what you you got me thinking about Trotskyism. What was your question?
Oh, it's more about like what would you account for progress?
Progress.
Let's talk about like what you predict would be good for what a techno-progressive would applaud in the next 10 to 30 years, saying short to medium term futures.
Well, one of the problems with transhumanism and enhancement is that we don't all agree on what are enhancements. What kinds of things people might do to each other. We've had this problem when we try to deal with the body modification crowd. They say, "Hey, why aren't you, slicing your tongue in half, or doing ritual scarification, or sticking bones through your nose? Because if you're a transhumanist, you should be doing that." And we go, "Well, we don't think that that's enhancement. Cutting your tongue in half doesn't really seem to do anything other than the aesthetic of grossing people out." Um, so, and there are kinds of things that some people think are enhancements that other people would think are not. So we have this debate around the autism rights movement, or ASPI movement. Some Aspies think that Asperger's is an actual form of enhancement because you're not as concerned about other people's emotions, and you have these extraordinary. Some autists have these extraordinary abilities to focus and cognitive abilities. But not all of us agree that losing a capacity for theory of mind would be an enhancement. It seems to actually be a cognitive disability, and most people who have that problem actually experience problems because of it. So part of the problem here is that we're not sure what's progress in terms of these potentialities that we've been advocating on behalf of. Yes, I think if someone chooses that they want to become autistic, then they probably should be allowed to. But what if you have kids in your society who are autistic? What do you do about them? Do you encourage their parents to take them to see therapists or take the anti-autism pill so that they can learn the theory of mind that everybody else has?
Hmm.
Those are legit, those are ongoing questions today about attention deficit disorder, obesity, all kinds of questions about what we consider to be legitimate rights of, parental autonomy versus what the government should step into. At any rate, the way that it relates to progress is that I don't think there's any agreement about what progress looks like at a global level either. I mean, one of the things I think many techno-progressives agree about is that having stronger transnational institutions would be a form of progress. But there are some anarchist-oriented or decentralist, at any rate, oriented techno-progressives who don't think that stronger transnational institutions, who don't like the European Union, for instance. I'm a big European Union fan. I think the idea of the European Union is still one of the most positive, progressive visions in the world, and it pains me the pains that it's having. And I would like to see the UN become stronger along the lines of the European Union. Not every techno-progressive thinks that that would be progress at all. So we have to have these debates, both about what constitutes progress in a technological framework around human enhancement. Would it be progress to start doing research on geoengineering, or is that just going more down the wrong path, because we would start screwing around with systems that we don't understand yet? These are all legitimate debates, but the thing that distinguishes us is that we're willing to think about and debate these kinds of ideas and frameworks.
That's interesting. Makes it very difficult to measure progress then. I mean, if there's so many different accounts for what progress means, I'd see that as being one of the problems that techno-progressives face. Or maybe one of the larger ones.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all goes back to John Stuart Mill. I mean, Mill said that ideally we should be in a society where we all get to choose our own visions of progress. There are constraints on how free any of us can do that because some people's ideas of progress impinge on other people's, or some people's ideas of what they want to do would impinge on other people's freedom. And so we have to have a collective structure that ensures the maximum of everybody's individual freedom within a framework of constraint. And also a discussion about what it means to have collective progress and collective goals. So you can't have roads just by having people pay out of their pocket, or having entrepreneurs decide to build roads. At least you can't yet. That's a collective action problem and a public good that has to be provided by a collective understanding of what progress is. That it's good. We're either going to have railway lines, trams, roads, flying cars, whatever it's going to be. We have to have that as a collective decision, and that, I think, is a recognition, again, from a techno-progressive point of view, of the inescapability of democratic politics, or the desirability of democratic politics. If you look at, I think, the most egregious thing that has come out of the transhumanist community in a while, and that accounts for a lot, is this terrible novel by Istvan Zoltan, Transhumanist Wager, which is basically a fascist fantasy novel about one man with terrible politics and values becoming global dictator. And, if that's the vision, is that the way to achieve anarchist paradise is through a totalitarian takeover, that's terrible. And I don't want that, to be the representation of any of our values. We have to be able to say, here's the democratic path to gradually expanding the sphere of individual liberty so that we all have access to the enhancements and the technological enablements that we are so passionate about.
Interesting. Do you think that that's what Zoltan Istvan wants to do by running for a presidency? Become a global dictator and take over the world?
No, well, obviously by running for president, I mean, he'd be organizing a beer hall putsch instead of running for president, I suppose, although Hitler was elected, so who knows. But I'm not saying that Zoltan's Hitler, and I'm not saying that he is even a fascist. His novel is a fascist fantasy novel, and anybody who salutes the values in that novel is pretty skiffy. Zoltan claims that he's not a fascist, and I'll take him at his word for that. I wish he'd written a different novel then. I just don't think that he's the right spokesperson for any kind of, and I don't think that transhumanists should engage in politics through the party structure at all, here or abroad, because transhumanism is not ideologically deep enough to organize a party. It's like, I mean, I felt the same way about the pirates, but the pirates have been relatively successful, but I think they're tapping into something cultural that is not just about digital rights. But to say, we're going to organize a party because we're enthusiastic about human enhancement technology. Okay, well, what's your policy about Food and Drug Administration? Do you think that there should be one, or do you think we should get rid of it, or do you think it should be, access to drugs should be speeded up through it? Or we don't agree. There's people on the libertarian end who think it should be gotten rid of, and there's people on the techno-progressive end who don't. And so if you don't agree about some pretty basic things that are central to your own value system and your own political engagement, then how the hell are you going to have a party? You have to have policies if you want to be a party. Well, at least unless you're Republicans, and then you can just be anti-Obama. But if you're a real political party, you have to have actual policies, things that you're for. What's the transhumanist position on progressive taxation? What's the transhumanist position on agricultural subsidies? No one has any freaking clue. So, maybe if you're an Israeli party or an Italian party, you can represent the 1% of the population that cares about transhumanism in a parliament and get elected and then have some legitimate raison d'etre. But in the United States, you have to get past the 50% representation to get into the government. And so you have to basically organize in the United States and in most countries as an interest group, a flavor, an ideological think tank, perhaps a political action committee that gets, that pours money into particular candidates who are going to be representing your set of issues or that might then be more receptive to our point of view, but not a political party. It doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'd like to drill down into what are some obvious contrasting stances to the techno-progressive stance, like biocon or whatnot. What are your favorite contrasting stances then?
Right. Well, the two big ones in the structure that I laid out in Citizen Cyborg, the two big or three big points of view were the bioconservatives, left wing and right wing. So the right wing bioconservatives, mostly religious bioconservatives, who think that human enhancement and other forms of technological progress are violations of God's plan for man, and opposed to it for those reasons. The Catholics thinking that anything that you want to do with procreation outside of one man, one woman, missionary position, and so forth, is against God's plan. Okay, I understand where they're coming from. That's one point of view. The left-wing bioconservatives who think that anything that, any kind of technological progress and their idea about which kinds kind of rolls along is going to be bad for women, bad for workers, bad for black people, etc. So they are the folks who talk about any kind of genomic choice as being eugenics, any kind of human enhancement technology as being something that's going to usher every disabled person into the gas chambers, etc. Legitimate concerns, from my point of view, about equality, legitimate concerns about the rights of minorities, women, etc. I'm on the same page with those values. I just don't happen to think that the technologies that they demonize have anything to do with the consequences that they associate with them. The principal problem with the Luddite point of view is recognizing that there's a social problem and then thinking that banning a technology will somehow fix that social problem. That's the principal Luddite problem. And what you have to do is try to convince those people, or convince everybody else at any rate, that the way to fix social problems is to fix social problems. If you're worried about patriarchy, you don't focus on sex selection, you focus on patriarchy, and then there'll be fewer abortions. Getting rid of sex-selective abortion in India would simply be bad for girls because then they would be born and be murdered. That's what used to happen. Is there used to be widespread female neglect and murder, and so now there's ultrasound and abortion. And as values change around the status of women in India, hopefully there'll be less of that. But the rights of women are not predicated on whether there's ultrasound and abortion or not. In fact, a woman's right to control the contents of her own womb is probably pretty important as a woman's right. And you as a Western feminist saying, oh my God, you need to ban every woman from having access to the contents of her womb and access to an abortion. That doesn't sound like a very feminist idea. Anyway, I could go on. But yeah. I forget, what was your original question?
What are the contrasting stances to the techno-progressive?
Okay, so I was illustrating the left bioconservatism. Left bioconservatism, legitimate concerns, Luddite solutions, problematic.
Okay.
Then you got the libertarian, libertarian transhumanists or libertarian futurists or whatever you want to frame them as. Basically, they're good on culture. So they tend to be good on sex, gender, religion, secularism, etc. But they're bad on economics. They're bad on the political economy question. They think that the solution is to get rid of the state and to let the market handle everything. And so we're obviously different from them. Now, the corners of that space that had been less fleshed out when I wrote Citizen Cyborg 10 years ago were whether there would be culturally conservative transhumanists that didn't seem to be entirely likely, because part of the things that led people to be attracted to transhumanism was a certain kind of neophilia, love of the new, low amygdala. Or so I used to say, we don't have very much of a gag reflex. And so, cultural conservatives tend to be the folks with high gag reflex. They gag at everything. But we're beginning to see flavors of this. So there's the Mormon Transhumanist Association, which is relatively big. They're not all culturally conservative, but some of them are. And they see transhumanist ideas and the singularity within the framework of Mormon prophecy. Now, there's certainly people on the right, Christian right, who see it that way also, but they tend to see it that transhumanists are minions of Satan working for, the apocalypse that they have planned for, and that they don't see us on the side of the angels. The Mormon transhumanists think that we're all on the side of the angels, that we're preparing God's plan for man through these technologies of immortal life and so forth. I think there'll probably be increasing ways in which that kind of syncretism with existing culturally conservative thought happens. Another question is, if it turns out that there's biological things going on in being gay, there's already some folks on the Christian right who are saying, well, in general, we're not so down with this genetic selection or screwing around with human biology. But if there's actually something biological about being gay, then we could see, selecting out that particular trait out of your kid. So again, do we want to allow that to happen? Do we think that gay kids should be born willy-nilly into Christian conservative families? Is that a good thing to happen? Or should we let Christian conservatives edit out their gay kids? So there's some really important questions there. But then the question is that actually culturally conservative transhumanism or not? I don't know, but there's beginning to be some of those forms of syncretism.
Okay, so people might be annoyed with some parts of techno-progressivism. What parts do you think people would be annoyed with? Let me just bring up some things like regulations. The whole cautionary tales that some techno-progressives may tell, claiming that they may claim that, I guess moratoriums or regulation gets in the way of research and scares funders away. So what are your thoughts? Let me just say that, Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking have both voiced concerns about AI getting smarter. That some people in the AI community have said, "Oh, look, these guys are lunatics, and their religious fantasies are getting getting in the way of progress on the ground in AI." So, yeah. What are your thoughts on some of the annoying aspects to some parties of the techno-progressive stance?
Well, I wouldn't say that Elon Musk was necessarily a techno-progressive. I think part of the problem is that if you're not engaged with the actual democratic process and the actual institutions of politics around the world, and you wave your hands about this was true, for instance, with Kurzweil. Kurzweil definitely comes from the neoliberal or the wing of transhumanism that's suspicious of government interference in science. His personal politics are pretty liberal, and he has been an advisor to the U.S. government. So he's not a libertarian by that stretch, but he didn't ever talk very much about technological risks in his work. And then suddenly, a couple of years ago, he discovered that people were decoding the genome and publishing it of the 1918 flu, and it freaked him out. And he said, "Oh my God, we need to ban that. We need to ban those scientists from publishing that flu genome, because who knows if they get their hands on that, what they would do." Well, okay, if you're not engaged day to day in the question of biosafety, then you might freak out when you hear about something like that. But really, this is a long discussion. We've been talking about how to have biosafety around hazardous biological materials and what kind of regulatory apparatus each lab should have in the country, and whether the federal agencies that are in charge of that have enough money. We've been talking about that for a long time. And to just suddenly say, oh my God, there's this one technological risk that requires us to ban something, that's caused by your political disengagement, by your lack of understanding of the democratic process. So, this is true in the singularitarian community, is that because they are, for the most part, either willfully ignorant about the actual existing institutions of cyber safety in the world and the discussions about cyber safety, or they believe that only 18-year-old high school dropouts in their pajamas in a loft in San Francisco can ever create the brilliant artificial intelligence that will save us all from Armageddon, and that governments are too stupid to ever do that. For whatever reason, they have very little interest in having, engaging with the actual world of people all over the world who are doing artificial intelligence research. If you really believe that they are going to create an existential risk for humanity, then you probably should be talking about ways to have regulatory approaches to who's going to create those risks and who's not, and how we're going to figure that out and how we're going to control those risks. If serious people in synthetic biology have been talking about the risks of synthetic biology related to bioterrorism. And they've been talking about ways to ensure lab safety and ensure that certain materials and certain kinds of gene printers don't get into the hands of the wrong kind of people. Nobody in artificial intelligence in the singularitarian community is talking about that because they don't think it's possible. Now, okay, then you either throw your hands up or you believe in a magical solution like creating the artificial intelligence that's going to be friendly and save us all from Armageddon. But there actually are solutions in between. There's actually agencies, military, police, corporate, there's all kinds of agencies working for cybersecurity throughout the world and for a more resilient internet, and the debate about the internet off switches, whether countries should have internet off switches and so forth, ways that we could become more resilient in the face of different kinds of AI threats. Now, another reason why these things don't get taken seriously is because of the tendency towards religious thought that never gets acknowledged as religious thought. So particularly around the question of artificial intelligence. Now, Nick Bostrom's book is a great leap forward. He's a very precise thinker. I'm not accusing him of this. But a lot of the people who have been worried about and talking about artificial intelligence basically imagine a scenario where something wakes up and in 10 seconds it's taken over the entire internet and it's turning us into paperclips. And if you think that that's the only scenario, then of course democratic policy makes no sense at all, because we're not going to control every little every little laptop in the world, and by the time we figure out that we've got a problem, it's going to be too late. But that's rapture thinking. That's apocalypse thinking. If you think it's going to be more like trying to control rats in New York, like the artificial life could start to emerge and cause problems for us that are just kind of erosive and annoying. And yes, it may grow eventually into something that is truly threatening. But if we figure out how to deal with the rats and the dogs, the wild dogs in the internet first, then we might be prepared for the marauding Genghis Khan of artificial intelligence that might come down the pike later. And that will require engagement with cybersecurity. So at any rate, there's many ways in which this is true, that that magical thinking and political disengagement and the lack of belief in the legitimacy of political and social institutions has infected the transhumanist movement and the futurist thinking in general.
Excellent. So, well, what would an aspiring techno-progressive be interested in being engaged in? What should they do in order to sort of further the cause on the ground now?
Well, anyone who finds that term resonant will find a happy home in the IET as a group of people who write and use that term often and who identify with that term. And so I would encourage you to contact us and become a part of our little ideological tendency. And I hope that we will see growing numbers of organizations not just us and a small group of French folks and a couple people in England, saluting that particular term, but a growing number are finding it useful to identify this particular niche of ideas, and in a variety of different ways. I mean, I would hope. I mean, again, I have a chastened imagination about these things, but it would be great if we eventually had a techno-progressive political action committee. We have talked vaguely about having a transhumanist political action committee, but as I said, who would we support? Would we, currently the most politically influential transhumanist in the country is Peter Thiel, who is a Christian conservative Republican, who's the principal financial backer for the anarchists candidates within the Republican Party, the Ron Paul and Rand Paul. I'm not anarchists. I mean, they're libertarians. And does that represent the politics of transhumanism? I hope not. From the surveys that I've done in the past, the majority of us are on the left. And certainly we're not anti-abortion the way that Ron and his father Rand, Ron and his son Rand are. The only reason that Thiel has been backing them is because they're the most anti-regulatory of the the most libertarian of the Republican candidates. And that's not the political litmus test for a transhumanist PAC. But if there were to be a transhumanist PAC, someone with Peter Thiel's money, a billionaire, is going to have a hell of a lot more voice about setting its political agenda than ordinary people would. So I think this is, again, one of the concerns. You have to stand for something more than just being a transhumanist, because being a transhumanist can mean having fascist fantasies. It can mean having a radical right-wing libertarian politics. Or it can mean standing for social justice and individual freedom and so forth within a reasonable context.
Okay. So, all right, that's great. So we've spoken a lot about the techno-progressive movement and the stance and what people can do today. As a take-home, what would you advise people? If people were just beginning with this concept, what would you advise people to do?
Well, not to be too self-serving, but reading my book, I'd love for them to do that. Citizen Cyborg, I'm working on a second, but it's not about
Buddha
politics.
Yep.
Cyborg Buddha, but you can listen to my other interviews with Adam about Cyborg Buddha. But Citizen Cyborg still stands up for me as a coherent explanation of the relation of bio and technopolitics and these various factions that I've talked about and why someone might want to be in our faction versus the others. And then there's an enormous body of writing at the IET website on all kinds of topics and a constant stream of videos and Adam's work and other people's work that will inform thinking on these topics. And then if they have particular interests, give us a call and we'll help situate them, orient them. There are lots of young scholars who contact us all the time and are interested in ways of applying these ideas to their work, and we are glad to help.
Okay, that's been fantastic. So I guess, as we draw to a close to this video on techno-progressivism, is there any concluding remarks that you'd like to say, other than what you've already said in the last two questions?
Well, when the Berlin Wall fell and Soviet communism collapsed, I thought that we were on the cusp of a new politics. And at the time, I was a socialist organizer. And I thought that social democratic thought was going to sweep the world because now it wouldn't be a fight between capitalism and communism, and the clear advantages of social democratic societies would come to the fore. What happened was that the social democratic model of progress within one country fell apart. Technology started to erode the workplace basis of the trade union movement and the kind of cultural basis of working class politics within many countries. And many social democratic parties had to appeal to middle class folks, and you had the Tony Blair kind of phenomena and other phenomena. And then you had, phenomena like Mitterrand and other brief victories of the left, where they would attempt to implement parties policies within their countries once they had a democratic election, and then there would be massive capital flight and disinvestment and so forth. I think what the period that we're at is we haven't figured out what the political model, how to organize citizens to have countervailing power against the interests of big corporations and the super rich, to take the place of the social democratic parties and the trade unions of the 20th century. We haven't figured that out yet. And my hope is that the promise of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and now the growing crisis of technological unemployment, that with the new electronic means of communication and organization that we see in the world, that we will begin to see new forms of citizen organization that will be the avenue, the vehicle for this new global left that I think we need to have. And so I'm hope it's not that techno-progressives are going to lead that charge, but I think that techno-progressives can help think about and maybe contribute to the creation of that new global set of institutions that will allow us to transcend the limitations of the old social democratic model and create a new one for the 21st century.
Excellent. Well, it's been fantastic having you here on the show again, and I'm looking forward to doing it again soon. Now, don't forget, everybody, if you've got some spare time, go to France and go to the Transvision conference, right?
Easier said than done, but...
Right. Yes, that's correct. But however, I'm sure there'll be some videos and some media coming out of the Transvision 2014 conference. After
Absolutely.
that happens, yeah, me and James will be also doing another video, and that will cover some of the topics raised at the conference about techno-progressive stances and some objections, some further discussion about how to take this forward and everything. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So thanks everybody for listening, and thank you, James, once again for having you on the show.
My pleasure.